All right, so again, for those who just joined, my name is Catherine Pizzella. I'm the Director of Chapter Development for DU International Headquarters, and I'm really excited to be hosting this judicial process training tonight. So just to get us started by introducing everyone to one another, would you all just go ahead and put your name, your chapter, and your role in the chat? So whether you're a chapter president, a vice president loss prevention, if you're a J board member, if you're an advisor, VP administration, whatever brought you here tonight, why this is relevant to your role, would you please just let us know who you are and where you're coming from? Thanks, Luke. Awesome. As you're working on that, I'm just going to touch on some ground rules for us. So I'm going to ask that you stay muted throughout unless you have a question, in which case you can jump in and interrupt me. But please use the raise hands feature. And if I don't see you again, feel free to interrupt me. I would love it if you all could keep your cameras on if possible. I'm not going to share my screen for most of the time, so we can all just look at each other. And I'd love for you all to participate in the conversation, either via voice or in the chat as you're doing. Thank you so much for continuing to introduce yourself. That's great. I love the representation from all the different chapters that we have here tonight. And also, like I said, take notes, use your handout that's in the chat. Feel free to download that, scroll all the way back up and find that and get that downloaded for yourself, save a copy to your desktop. And really start to think about like who else might need to be here who you're not seeing in the attendee list, because we're going to want to make sure that those guys get involved for part 2, which is this time next week, right? So I will be able to send this recording to them and the handout, and they can review it between now and next week and hopefully join us. Hopefully we'll have twice as many people here next week. So as we go through, really start to think about who from your chapter should have been here that needs to be here and get this content. We'll make sure they get connected by next week. Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of advance our slides. Please let me know if you're not seeing this. We should be on learning objectives now, right? This is what we're doing during our time together. If you took the pretest, thank you so much. That's helpful data for us. It's completely anonymous. It just gives me a sense of where we're at going into this training. But our learning objectives are the items that you checked through during the pretest, right? So we're going to define self-governance and accountability in DU. We're going to talk about where resources related to judicial processes are located for you all. We're going to talk about who should be on the J board and what sort of behaviors and characteristics those people should exhibit to have a productive J board that's reinforcing accountability and promoting brotherhood in our chapters. We're going to talk about ways that the Judicial Board receives cases, identify types of incidents that should be reported to IHQ, which is slightly different than what goes to J board. We're also going to identify the scope of an investigation according to our guidance, and in that investigation, be able to distinguish between credible and incredible or not credible evidence. We're going to talk about the standard of evidence that we use in fraternity judicial cases and talk about what the difference is between mediation, judicial board hearings, and chapter hearings. Finally, to wrap it up, we're going to talk about how severity and repetition of behavior influence our decision and how we handle cases. And then we're going to practice matching example or hypothetical cases with either a mediation, a judicial board hearing, or a chapter hearing response. So that is a lot, and we are going to fly. I hope that you're ready to keep up with me. I hope that you're ready to take notes, participate. There's going to be tons of activities. So this is going to be really interactive. But I am going to stop sharing my screen so we can all just see one another. Awesome, and it's great to see you guys. Thanks again for being here. So now that we're familiar with one another and understand the roadmap for what we're doing here, let's get started. Right, so I just want you to take a minute to reflect and think about what it means to you to be a brother of Delta Upsilon. And I'm not going to ask you to share, just take a minute to think about that. And then think about how the brothers in your chapter or the members of the chapter that you advise hold one another accountable to the oath that you all took at initiation. What are those formal or informal mechanisms that you have in the chapter that keep it running, really, right? Obviously, the fraternity's expectation of members is to hold one another accountable to the oath that you took at initiation and that you all recite at every initiation that you hold, right? And sometimes we forget that that includes our mission as a fraternity, which is to build better men, of course, right? And so our judicial processes are really opportunities to help one another grow from maybe not the best decisions that we've ever made or mistakes that we've made. And I'm gonna give you a little personal example of that. Just a moment of vulnerability, right? When I was in college, I had the opportunity to serve as vice president and then president of my chapter. So I had a whole year on exec as vice president before I became in charge. And as a very gung-ho little junior, when I got that presidency, I said, okay, things are gonna be different around here. My advisor is bugging the you know what out of me. And I just cannot stand that she has key card access to the house and she is here all the time. It's really making me very annoyed, and I can't get anything done in my personal life because every time I'm downstairs just trying to make a sandwich for myself at lunchtime, she's coming in and asking all these questions about my sorority, and I don't have time to think about that right now. So what did I do as little president? I just marched myself right into residence life and I said, could you please remove my advisor's key card access to my chapter facility? Because things were going to be different under my presidency. Well, it didn't even take me as long to walk back to my house as I was already getting text messages from other members of my chapter, particularly older members of my chapter. And then we immediately had a sit down conversation when I got back to the house about that, how that was not the right thing to do. It was not only not sisterly, but was not actually going to solve the root cause of the problem, and that I needed to work on my relationship with our chapter advisor. And that intervention that happened was one of the most significant things that ever happened to me in my young membership in my sorority, right? And just those upperclassmen that texted me, and then that upperclassman that pulled me aside when I got back to the house and said, our advisor is one of the best things about this organization. She is the person that keeps us going. This is how we treat her. This is how we engage with her. You know, can I help you sort through your problems with her? Was honestly sisterhood in action, right? And that was accountability and sisterhood in action all at the same time. Fast forward, 15 years later, that person is one of the best influences in my life and one of my closest friends, even though there are decades in between our ages and we had completely different membership experiences. Not to say that we don't bump heads to this day, but I identify with this topic because I have benefited from moments where my sisters have called me out for things I should have handled differently. And that's what we want to encourage in this process, right? Regardless of what type of response you're having to an incident, whether it's an informal mediation or a super formal chapter hearing, we want to make sure that we are calling members back in on the policies and back in on the things that they said they were going to do as DU members, right? So that's why this topic is important to me. And I hope that's a good example of something that you all can relate a little bit to get us started. So what I'm going to ask you to do is go to your handout where you see self-governance defined, and I'm going to ask Chuck to read that out loud for me.
I'm not sure I have the handout.
All right. Anyone have the handout? Want to read the definition of self-governance for me? While someone finds it, I'll let you find it. I'm going to introduce John and Kenny, who are our other two consultants at our Kansas expansion. So thanks, guys, for joining. Luke, were you going to help us out there?
Yeah, I can do it if you need me to.
Thank you.
Self-governance now, the system by which members of community or organization act on their principles and values in order to develop an ethical code of acceptable behavior, resolve grievances, elect leaders, and discipline members, inherently based on a responsibility to do the right thing, but not to be confused with an unquestioned right to do anything the group chooses.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to give you guys just a minute to make sure you have the handout downloaded, but also get to that definition and go ahead and highlight things that stick out to you or underline, however you want to kind of mark up that document virtually, digitally, right? Go ahead and use those Word tools. That's why I made it a Word document. So find something in there that really sticks out to you. And then once you've done that, just drop in the chat, like, what's that word or phrase that really jumped out at you? We've got ethical. Thanks, Luke. You're ahead of the curve because you already had it ready and you read it. All right, we've got ACT, we've got acceptable behavior. What else is sticking out? To do the right thing. I really like inherently based on our responsibility to do the right thing, but not to be confused with the unquestioned right to do whatever we want, right? I love that part, that ending part there. So why is the topic of self-governance important to the judicial process in fraternity life? Anyone take a stab at that? Thomas, what do you think? Why are we talking about self-governance at the beginning of a judicial board training?
Wait, I missed the beginning question.
Yeah, why are we talking about self-governance?
Because with, I don't know, depending on how big everyone's chapters are here, but it's kind of hard to, govern 50 to 100 members of an entire fraternity. And so if everybody can have accountability and kind of act in that self-governing definition, I guess, then it makes our jobs as loss prevention or members of the J board easier, and makes sure that everyone's doing the right thing, because we can't be everywhere at once.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That wasn't even what I was thinking about, but you made me think about there's different levels of accountability in a fraternity, right? And so there's individual accountability, like I'm going to be accountable to the promises I made or to the 4 founding principles or that oath, right? There's the accountability that comes with leadership and you as judicial board or advisors, holding members accountable. And then you go above the chapter level, right? There's the universities and colleges that you all exist on, and then there's IHQ, and certainly those entities are holding your chapters accountable. And so there is accountability at multiple levels, but ultimately what I was thinking about when I wrote that is that fraternities are self-governing organizations at any of those levels or all of those levels. That's what we are, right? And we function because we're able to do the right thing when no one is looking, right? That's what keeps us going. If we weren't doing the right thing, we would start to self-destruct. And we see that. We see it in the media. We see chapters closing on different campuses. We see these major incidents where people were choosing the wrong thing or choosing to go against their values or the oath that they took. And then the chapter has significant consequences, right? So that's why I think that's important. And so I want to make sure that we're clear about the term accountability when we talk about it. And so, you have a definition or you have an area where you can write a definition of accountability there, right? To me, I think it's the mechanism we use to remind people of the oath that we took, right? We talk a lot about accountability in fraternity life, but sometimes we don't stop to define it. And so would you just take a moment to kind of think about, like, how would you explain accountability to someone in your own words? Like, jot down just like a phrase or a sentence, like how do you define accountability? I just defined it for you all for how I think about it. How do you define it? And as you finish, just throw it in the chat for us. I like that, Greg. Principles and values. What else did you guys come up with? Oh, that was from the self-governance definition. All right, what are you coming up with for accountability? Holding others to positive standards, like that, Nathan. Glad you made it in here. I saw you registered and I was worried about it, but I'm glad you're here. Thank you. Didn't know if you were gonna get that link in time. What else did you all come up with? Being responsible, Thomas, thank you. I'll share mine to be fair. If you like something that someone else wrote, feel free to steal it and type it right into your handout. All right, So now I'm gonna direct you to the next line of that handout, right? I have a quote. Can someone read that quote about brotherhood for me? It's an equation, really. All right, I've got it for you. Here we go. Brotherhood is a noun. Brotherhood equals friendship plus accountability. What do you guys think about this? What are your reactions to this idea? Parker, I see the gears turning. What's going on in your head? We can't hear Parker. Anyone else? What are your thoughts or reactions to this quote?
I like it. I like it because I think that it kind of goes a step further than the whole friendship part, which I think from an outside perspective is what some people might think brotherhood is. It's holding each other to higher standards and pushing each other to be like a better version of yourself. Also, Catherine, could you post the practice book in the chat again? I think it disappeared.
Yeah, you got it. Give me
Thank
one
you.
second. Yep, 1 second. There you go. Oh, no, it's open. I have it open, so I can't post it. Give me 1 second. All right, there you go. All right, another question. Why is accountability an important part of a healthy chapter culture?
It's important for keeping the chapter safe with like the school and like the laws wherever you are.
Definitely, I like that idea. What else do you think? Said, why is accountability an important part of a healthy chapter culture? I think it keeps us. Go
You
ahead.
said that the goal was to build better men, and I think that happens through accountability by holding each other to that higher standard.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say. Thanks, Greg. I think there's a lot of distractions in life right now, right? There's a lot of things that we could get easily distracted by that people think fraternities are supposed to be about, but we want to make sure that we're about what we say we're about, right? So we have 4 founding principles in DU, we have our mission, right? You have all those pieces of your ritual, and I think accountability is the thing that ties us to the purpose of why we exist and why you all joined in the first place. So I think that that's really important. So before we get too far in, I want to make sure that I mention where you can find some additional resources related to this topic. Does anybody know where you can find all of the J-Board kind of templates and process documents and things other than what I shared with you as a handout today?
Are you wanting
There you
to answer that? Oh, okay, there we go.
Yeah, there you go. On our website, if you go to resources and then chapter resources, it's under the Vice President for Loss Prevention. I know some of you have a different officer who is the chair of the J-Board, but the chair of the J-Board in theory should be the Vice President for Loss Prevention. So all the resources are listed under that officer role on our website. Okay, so now that we've established the importance of accountability, let's choose the right people to begin our process of building a judicial board. So I'm going to run a poll, and you all are going to participate on the poll via Zoom about what type of makeup for a judicial board is allowed by DU. And by makeup, I mean like a composition, like who is allowed to be on the J board. So here you go. Take a minute to fill that out. Only has 2 questions, shouldn't take that long. There are also no trick questions. Only one is right. All right, ran the poll in 3 seconds. 2, 1. All right, how do we do? Can you all see the results? Great. All right, so our choices are every academic class can elect their own members of the J board. The vice president for loss prevention, the president appoint 1 to 2 members. Each associate member class appoints a member for the J board. Nobody went for that one. Any of the above are acceptable and none of the above are acceptable. And the correct answer there is any of the above are acceptable per DUIHQ. In your bylaws, you may have something written and you should be following whatever you have written. So if you chose what you have written, you are also correct. But from an international headquarters perspective, we will take any of those 3 models. What's really important to us is that your chapter votes on those people. So however they get selected, whether they are elected by the membership of a class, like an associate member class or an academic class, or they're appointed and then elected, we want to make sure that the chapter has a say in who is on that board, because that's going to help with buy-in when the board has to make tough decisions and potentially hand out sanctions, right? So knowing that they had a say in who those people get to be is really important for that process. And so obviously the answer to the second question is that chapters are free to choose a model that works best for them, obviously within reason and, you know, along the guidelines I just mentioned of the chapter being able to elect those people. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. The other consideration is what characteristics and behaviors we want to see from the people who are serving on our J board. So scroll down in your handout to the place where it says who should serve on the J board and just start typing a list of when you think about a judicial board that is high functioning, that's increasing accountability in your chapter and increasing brotherhood, what sorts of qualities or attributes should the people have? And these can be things they either have inherently or things we train them on, but what sorts of things would you want them to be or do? And if you would just paste your favorite word that you came up with in the chat for me, that would be really great. So we can see what everybody came up with. I'll take more than one. If you want to paste your whole list, I'm fine with that too. Truthful and respected. I like those two, Sean. Great job. Integrity. Credible. Yes. Honesty. Confidential. Accountable. Level-headed. Thoughtful. Articulate. Fair. I like these. Lead by example, trusted, awesome. Right, so you all know this isn't rocket science, but I just want to make sure that we're being thoughtful in our selection, that these are conversations you're having before you do select those people in your chapter, right? We want to make sure we get the right people on the bus and train them along the journey. So no one is perfect, but if you're choosing the right people who have a proclivity to exhibit these qualities, then you, with some training, can reinforce your expectations of what you want to see as they serve on your J board. Right? Can you just raise your hand if you already have a J board training in place? Something that you do to kind of orient people to the role once they accept that position. Anyone? That might be a resource we need to work on for you all. So maybe that's a cue for me that I need to be helping you with that. So happy to do that if you think that's helpful. Okay, cool. Any questions so far? All right, so for the rest of our time together, we're going to talk about how you prepare for a case, regardless of how it's adjudicated. So now that you had an opportunity to do a little bit of a warm-up poll or quiz, we're going to take a much more in-depth quiz. If you go to the next page on your handout, there's a true-false quiz about the roles and functions of judicial boards. So we're going to take this together. What I want to do is I'm going to read the statements out loud, and I want you all to put in the chat what you think the answer is. And then when I tell you the answer, you can mark it on your handout. You can highlight it or underline the correct answer so you have it, you know, for your notes for the future. And then I'm going to stop and annotate and give thoughts about each one as we go as well. So you'll also see below the quiz, there's a little section where you can put notes in, or you can feel free to just enter down, you know, below each talking point and enter my thoughts if you want to scribble a note there, but you can do that as we go as well. Okay. So the first one is chapter judicial boards should meet weekly. True or false? You just put T or F. That one is true. So true, in fact. Nathan said it's so true. Yes, they should meet weekly. I think it's a common misconception that they should just wait around and then when a case gets assigned, then you schedule a meeting. I'd strongly encourage you to be having a weekly meeting, just like exec, where the judicial board is meeting. You have other things maybe potentially to look at, we can talk about later. Certainly that's when you can organize yourself and hear about cases, and you can hear cases. And then when something comes up, you don't have to like scramble to get a bunch of people's schedules together. You all are so busy. It is just easier if you have that standing time. You can always cancel the meeting if nothing's going on, but you need to be ready to have that meeting and have it on the schedule and have a room reserved and all those things. Right, okay, so the next one, chapter judicial boards do not have any additional responsibilities other than hearing cases. Good job, that one is false. Okay, so I almost started to give that one away in my last answer, right? But things you can do in addition, right? You have a responsibility to teach your membership the rules. There might be some collaboration with the chapter president or vice president member education on that one, but you are the guardians of the rules. So in terms of like your CEP requirement of reviewing the LP policies once a semester, like the J board can be involved in that. You have a responsibility to review your constitution and bylaws at least, I'm going to say every semester, but CEP I think says every 18 months or 15 months, something like that. You are going to be the group that is assigning sanctions potentially. So you also should be the people that are following up on sanctions. So you might not have an active case to hear, but you should be meeting to review like who has outstanding sanctions that they haven't completed, who do we need to check in with, all that kind of stuff. And then you can also help the associate member educator review the LP policies during associate member education. So you can spend your committee time working on that. I think beyond that, you can also just talk about like, how are things going in our chapter? Like, how is accountability going? How is brotherhood going this semester? Are there, you know, general incidents or rumblings we need to discuss? Right? You should be a group that is constantly kind of monitoring accountability and brotherhood in the chapter. So there's plenty to do. All right, next one. Incidents may be reported to the judicial board only through a formal incident report form, which chapters should create themselves. False. I can't fool you guys at all. Okay. So they can come to you in any kind of way, right? Someone can text you. I know screenshots are a big thing, right? Get a lot of screenshots at IHQ and amongst yourselves, right? So text, call, tell you in person. You can, see it in a group message. You can see it live with your eyes at an event, right? You definitely do not need everybody to do a formal incident report form, but I know a lot of chapters have one. I think that's a good practice. And if you'd like to implement one, I can give you a template. You can just email me afterwards and we can connect on that. It's great to have, but know that incidents can come kind of from all places. Right, next one, all chapter and member incidents should be reported through the incident reporting form on deltau.org. What do you think? So basically what that one means is anything that you guys are hearing as a J board should come to IHQ. And you're right that that is false. We don't need to know about every little incident that is a violation of your policies, your study hours policy, your homecoming rules, like your house rules, whatever you're adjudicating locally. I don't necessarily need to know about. However, can anyone think of something like what's the threshold for something that should come my way at IHQ? Does anyone know?
I would say a financial or legal risk.
Definitely. I would say anything that may result in a loss or a lawsuit, right? So anything that might result in a loss of property, money, human life, safety, well-being. If they're injured or were injured, right? And there could potentially be a claim made against our insurance that you all pay for, right? Those would be things that we would want to know about and want to help you through. And we need to notify our insurance company about as well and put them on notice. And then if you need assistance with a case, you can certainly report it, or you can just reach out to your IHQ liaison or myself for assistance. You don't have to use the form, but there might be situations where you bring something to your liaison, and then because it may result in a claim, we ask you to do the IHQ reporting form. But not everything that you all handle needs to come our way unless you need help or it meets one of those thresholds. Okay, next one is chapter judicial board members are responsible for constantly monitoring all chapter events, activities, and electronic communications for violations of fraternity policies. False. I don't expect you to be out there like secretly investigating everything or going to look for trouble. I also don't expect you to stick your head in the sand, right? If you see it, you need to do something about it, but you're a human too, you're a student first, you're also a member of the chapter. And so you don't need to be like constantly policing or parenting or patrolling. Likely when you have social events in particular, you probably have an entire team of like sober monitors that does that. And then if something were to happen, they would document it and report it to you. You don't necessarily always need to be on in terms of going to look for things. But if you see something, you obviously have an obligation to resolve it and bring it to your judicial board chair and your president and your advisor. Okay, judicial board members should be role models for member behavior in all their actions, words, and deeds. I think that's an obvious one. That's obviously true, right? Judicial board members are responsible for investigating reported incidents. Nathan got a double in there, the last question and now this question, right? Are judicial board members responsible for investigating incidents? So you're confused because I said you just didn't have to, but you think it's true, and it is true, right? So if it is an actual reported incident, and there needs to be investigation, right? If what comes to you is not complete in and of itself, if you are not ready to then just move right to your next part of the process, if you need to collect more information, it will fall on the J board to do that. It doesn't have to be the entire J board, but it can be, certain parts of you, depending on how many people there are to talk to. It might require everybody. It just varies based on the situation. On the next page of the handout, there is a guide for conducting an internal investigation. So if you ever need to reference that, that's there as well. All right, judicial board should consider all information or evidence equally in an investigation, right? Is all evidence in an investigation equal? Bobby is our lone dissenter and winner on this one, right? So this question is meant to get at the point where some information probably holds more weight than others. And what would be an example of that? Something you might consider is, why is someone sharing this with you, right? What motivation do they have to share this information or for there to be an outcome as a result of this information? Right? Most of the time we want to believe information that's coming our way on face value, but we also know that sometimes people either report people or make up stories or things like that just because they have it out for somebody. Or you might be calling someone in for something that happened and they might be lying about their involvement in it because they fear consequence, right? If living in the house is where they literally reside, they may fear being kicked out of the house, right? And you likely won't remove them from the house. That would be like a very high level situation where that would be even on the table, but their immediate assumption is like, my life is over, I'm gonna get kicked out of the house, I'm gonna get kicked out of the fraternity, right? So they may have motivation to lie. And so sometimes you need to think about that and like, what are you hearing against what is the concrete information that you have and what makes the most sense? Which kind of brings us to the next one, which is our standard of evidence in making decisions. So the statement says the standard for making decisions in Delta Upsilon is the clear and convincing standard. Is that true or false? This one is false, and Bobby wins again. Festa's with him. Great job, Clarkson. All right, so we use a preponderance of the evidence standard, which is, you can write this down, 50% plus 1, or if the scales were equal, it's like that feather lands on one side and it just tips it so slightly to one side, right? It is more likely than not that something happened. And this mirrors what most universities use as their standard, right? Clear and convincing is what's mostly used in a court of law and criminal cases. The preponderance of the evidence standard is more commonly used in educational institutions and civil cases. So that's what we use in DU, right? If we have a process where we want to impact behavior and really just be setting expectations and resetting expectations and kind of, like I said, calling people back in, we don't need to go to all the way of beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? We just need to go to like, did this probably happen? Yeah, the information says it probably did. So let's just talk about it and like move on. Or no, I really just don't have enough information to say that this probably happened. So case dismissed, right? And so that's what we use in DU. And the last statement here is every reported incident goes to a judicial board hearing. Is that true or false? False. You're right? You already know this because it's in your pretest. We have mediations and chapter hearings. Awesome. Does anybody have any questions about all of that information we just covered? I'm very impressed with your scores on that. Most of you have not attended a JBoard training before, but about half of you have JBoard experience prior to this. So that tells me that your chapters are doing this process right, because you got nearly all of all of those questions right. I don't know if you're just following the guide before you, but either way, you found the right answer. So good for you. Okay, so now that we've covered how to prepare for cases, let's talk about what happens when you've gathered all the info and you're trying to decide what type of option between mediation, judicial board hearing, and chapter hearing you're going to select, right? Sometimes I think our chapters think about judicial board hearing as the only choice. And I even caught myself falling into that trap when I was designing this training. When this was emailed to all of you, it was titled Judicial Board Training. And then somewhere along the way, I switched it to call it Judicial Process Training, because not everything that you all do is about a judicial board hearing. So I'm trying to shift that language, and I think that would be helpful internally too. Like, we have judicial processes, J board hearings are part of it, and the J board oversees it. So in some senses, my title is correct, right? It's training for the J board, but it gets a little bit confusing. And I don't want people to forget that mediation and chapter hearings are also good tools that you can use on the chapter level, right? Mediation can occur prior to a formal meeting. And some incidents on the flip side are too severe and might require significant outcomes where you have to have a full chapter hearing to discuss the issue. So what we're going to do really just for the rest of the time is to review the differences between the three and really test your knowledge on how you would decide which type of method to use. So if you scroll past the investigation guide down to the next page after that, it's called 3 accountability methods or something like that. Let me find it on my, yes, 3 accountability methods, right? So we have mediation, judicial board hearing, and chapter hearing. So can someone volunteer to read the mediation part for me?
All right, I'll do it.
Thanks, Nathan.
All right. A mediation is a structured conversation between chapter leadership and a member or members to examine, process, and redirect behavior as well as review expectations.
Keep going.
I keep going. Okay. A mediation is commonly used when the judicial board chair has identified low risk factors, i.e. cleanliness of house, minor inappropriate behavior, etc. A brother can voice a concern about another brother's minor behavior. It can be anonymous, or typically first time an incident complaint occurs that is low risk. An informal discussion, recommendation, and documentation can be a meaningful way to help members change their behavior and avoid future harm.
Awesome, thank you. Who wants to volunteer to read the next section about judicial board hearings?
I can do that one.
Thanks, Bobby.
A judicial board hearing is a meeting between a member or members and the J board where formal charges are made. Each side presents information and a determination of responsibility, potentially with sanctions, is made. A J board hearing may be held when an incident cannot be resolved by mediation, an incident is more severe or violates major policy or law, or is considered high risk, or repeated behavior needs to be addressed. A formal hearing provides structure to complicated cases with lots of information to consider and reiterates to members the seriousness of the alleged violations.
Right, so I want to hone in on that last sentence, right, where we have a lot of information to consider. One major difference between mediation and J board hearing is you can have witnesses come into a J board hearing, right? And so if there's a lot of people with a lot of stuff to share about something that happened, it might make more sense to have a J board, even if it's kind of low level, because it just creates some structure to organize all of that. And you can kind of give everyone their turn to come in and say their say, right? Versus trying to mediate that a little bit informally, just might be like, you might be chasing your tail, right? Because if I have a conversation with Bobby and he tells me one thing, but then what Bobby tells me contradicts what Nate said, now I have to go back and find a time to connect with Nate. So it's like, if we just bring everyone together at a set time and everyone has an opportunity to talk in the same space, we can get to the answers faster, right? So I think that's a really kind of key thing to think about when you choose between those two. Finally, who wants to read about a chapter hearing?
I can do this one. A chapter hearing is a meeting of the entire chapter with a member or members where formal charges are made. Each side presents information and a determination of responsibility, potentially with sanctions, is made. A chapter hearing is called when behavior is so severe it may warrant sanctions beyond the authority of the judicial board. A member is being considered for suspension of membership beyond 3 months. A member is considered for permanent expulsion from the chapter/fraternity, or a member is being considered for a potential fine of over $100 that is not already outlined in chapter governing documents. A chapter hearing formally addresses egregious behavior and gives all chapter members the opportunity to consider the best outcome for the situation in line with chapter and fraternity policies.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm not going to get into those sanctions of like suspension beyond 3 months, expulsion, fine of 100. We're going to do that in part 2 next week. So just get beyond that, but that's really some things that distinguish that from a judicial board hearing. But really it's those highest of high level cases where there are going to be really significant outcomes for a member, right? We ask that that happens with the whole chapter. And so what I want to shift into now is an activity where we're going to choose. I have some sample cases, and I'm going to ask you to choose which type of response you would pick. So I'm just going to run this poll. It's going to be a poll right in Zoom. So I'm launching that now. You should see it. And so just go through each of the scenarios and choose mediation, judicial board hearing, or chapter hearing for each one. All right, you guys are almost done. Maybe a couple more minutes to finish up the last one or two. Try not to put any huge trick questions in there, but we can talk through whatever ones are confusing. I'll just wait for a couple more responses. And then I'll end it in 3, 2, 1. All right. So let's go through these together. Can you all see the responses now? Yes, okay, awesome. So the first one is damage to chapter property, whether it's tabling materials, letters, your house, whatever your property is, things you own as a chapter. J-board hearing, I think, is the most reasonable one. I think, again, if it's low level, I could see a mediation. If it's really, really high level, chapter hearing. But on average, I think you all, like, the majority wins on that one. Assault of another brother, I like the way we're trending here. I think right severity is something I would think about in that case, whether I choose between judicial board hearing or chapter hearing, but that's where I would skew in that one. Underage drinking, it seems like we're a little bit more all over the map. I would err in the middle there. It's a safe route, where most of you landed there. Racially motivated bias incident, the majority says chapter hearing. I would agree, depending on kind of the contents of it, of course, providing a lot of qualifiers here, as you can tell, right? Context is everything. So missing required meetings or events without being excused. Most people would start with a mediation. I like where your head's at. I think if we saw repeated behavior, I would support formal hearings in that case, depending on what prior conversations, but I would say start with a mediation there. Not paying dues or making payments on an established payment plan. Definitely mediation or J-board hearing, depending on the situation, depending on the member, their history with paying dues, right? kind of how much is outstanding, et cetera. I could see a place where that might eventually get to a chapter hearing, but on kind of the first go around or first couple, I think the mediation and hearing is appropriate. Not paying dues, or, oh, we got the same question twice. Don't know how that happened. I will fix that for next time. Thank you. Theft of another organization's property. J-board hearing. Yeah, I like that. I like that as a choice. Okay, great. Does anybody have any questions based on that? If you were kind of one of those off votes? All right, what did you guys notice about those responses? Why do you think they were inconsistent? You know, why don't we all have the same answer to every question?
I think all of our chapters have like different experiences. So like in our past experiences, we have different like opinions on how, on like the severity of each of them.
Yeah. I think every chapter has and every campus has a different threshold for certain behaviors and responses based on their individual chapter culture, campus culture. There's a lot of factors that influence those things. And I think generally that's okay, right? As long as behavior is being addressed, as long as there is an accountability mechanism being used and there's some formal documentation that the chapter is addressing an incident, I can get behind a lot of those choices that you made within reason, right? Like when I say within reason, right, it's like a sexual misconduct case would not be handled by mediation, right? Like when there's certain things, we're going to ratchet it up to at least a J-board hearing. And, you know, your advisors and myself, your liaisons can always help kind of consult if you're having a hard time deciding like which mechanism to use. But I mostly want you to know, one, that you have the three at your disposal. So there's three different choices, and two, they generally go in order of severity from mediation to J-board hearing to chapter hearing, and what each of those kind of can accomplish, right? So go to the next page where you have a graph, right? Nice X and Y axis for Tuesday at 9 o'clock Eastern. And so as you kind of thought through, and I spilled this in my commentary, right? What are two factors that I'm going to tell you to think about that might belong on those axes as you decide, should something be mediation, J-board hearing, or chapter hearing? What could, I'll just take one, right? You don't have to have both, but what's one thing you think should go on there?
Severity is definitely one of them.
Severity is definitely one of them. I think severity times two, right? Severity in terms of the policy, right? Like if you have a chapter policy that like you have to put your dishes in the dishwasher, that's a little bit different than like a physical assault, right? We have policies on kind of varying levels of severity. And we also have severity of incident, right? So let's go back to like the racially motivated bias incident, right? There is very egregious and severe intentional harm. And then there's someone used a word they actually didn't know what it meant and caused unintentional harm. And while it's still a problem, we're coming at it from a different direction, right? Because it's a less severe situation. So both of those things I think need to be taken into account when you think about severity, right? So severity of incident and severity of policy violation. What's the other thing that I'd encourage you to consider on that other axis?
Would like repeat offenses be the other thing?
Yep, you got it, Luke. So I'm calling that like repetition, or you can call it occurrence, like whatever makes sense to you. Like how many times have they done this thing, right? We're going to be a little more lenient and a little bit more friendly and brotherly and approach with a mediation conversation when it's low level and first time behavior. But as soon as people start to consistently violate the same policy, that's when we're also going to kind of step up our response and make sure we have a much more formal response. So it's not like first strike mediation, second strike judicial board, third strike chapter hearing necessarily. It can be that, but it's not necessarily. But in general, right, we're moving from less severe to more severe response when there's multiple violations of the same policy, or just a member who just consistently is violating all the policies and doesn't seem to really care about following them, right? And so make sure that you take time to write those in on your chart so you remember those two, whatever you want to say in your own words there, right? So severity and then repetition is what I called it, but you can call it whatever you want. And it doesn't matter which axis you put which label on, right? Generally, the more severe and the more repetitive a situation is, the more likely you are to need a formal method. So it works both ways there. So what questions do you have about how to choose the right type of accountability method for the type of case that you're facing?
Catherine, I'll go.
Thanks, Dan.
So I understood that depending on the severity of the potential offense that you're dealing with, you might want to go to a chapter meeting. But let's take a case of maybe an allegation of sexual assault. Do we automatically take that to a chapter meeting, or do we investigate it to some degree and then say, geez, there's some meat to this allegation and we think this ought to go to the chapter meeting?
Couple things, great question. One, I would always want a sexual assault reported to IHQ, right? That is a potential loss, it's a potential lawsuit, it's a potential claim. So IHQ always wants to know if there's a physical assault, sexual assault, any of that kind of stuff. Let's get involved with that. Let's help you through that. Secondly, you know, we all know that we get different amounts of information in reports, right? Sometimes we'll get an anonymous report where someone says, Brother John Farmington sexually assaulted me last Saturday night, but they don't even sign it. They forget to sign it. Like, they're being so anonymous that they don't even sign it, right? That's not actionable, right? So there's certain things that come to us that we just can't do anything about because we don't have enough information and there's no way to investigate them. So then there's things where it's like, if it's signed, then we can at least go back to the person and ask a few questions, get some more information. Or the initial report we receive might be pages and pages, and it's so much information. We automatically know by reading it, there's really nothing else that we could gain by investigating that incident. We might need to go to the brother and certainly hear their side of the story if they're the accused, which is why they would be coming to the hearing, right? But that's what the hearing is for, is to give them that opportunity to share their piece. So it really depends on the initial report and how much information you're confident about before going forward. And so that's where, like, advisors can help, IHQ liaison, myself can help, where if you get a report and you're just not sure, like, are we good to just handle this, or do you think we need more information and do investigation? Like, I can help consult in those cases. But that's what I would say to that.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Can you all just take a minute as we wrap up to let me know by putting in the chat, what is your biggest takeaway from this session? Either what's your biggest takeaway, or what's something that you're going to start doing as a result of this information, or what's something you're going to stop doing as a result of this information. Great, Bobby. Yes, Clarkson's gonna have to have weekly meetings. Yeah, difference between the things. Troy, I don't think you have too much to learn. You all did pretty good on that quiz, so I think you guys are doing great, but that's why you're here. I'm glad that this was generally helpful. I know some of it's probably repetitive depending on how much previous experience you have, but hope that everybody found at least one thing that was valuable. So last thing I want you to do, since there is part 2 next week, is write again in your handout, just write down, like, now that we've heard all this, what is a question that I have for next time, so you don't forget it. I'll tell you what we're going to do next week. Next week, we're actually going to go through the 3 methods, and we're going to talk about the process that you use so that you all know, like, step by step, kind of how those mechanisms should be implemented, right? Because there is a formal structure for something like a J-board hearing and a chapter hearing, and there's rules and things that come into play. So we'll go through all the nitty gritty, in particular, probably all the things you thought we were going to do today, we're going to do next week. And then we're also going to end with sanctioning and discussing like how we choose the right sanctions and when we give sanctions and, you know, what is the end goal of actually doing these processes. So that's what we'll do next week. So write down whatever questions that you don't want to forget that you have. Of course, because I had a pre-test, you know there's a post-test. So I'm just going to put that right in the chat. You can either click that now to take immediately and get it done with, or I will also email it to you tomorrow if you forget to take it tonight or you have to run to the next thing. So before you go, just make sure you do write down the things you don't want to forget to talk about next time. Copy the post-test link, or, you know, just take it out of the chat now, save it someplace to remember to do it later. Make sure that you have part 2 on your calendar, right? It's next week, same time, Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, but it will be a different Zoom link and a different pre-test, right? So we'll test on the knowledge that we're going to cover next week. So make sure that you look out for an email from me with the new Zoom link and the new pre-test for next week, and take both, please. And then if there are people that weren't here tonight that you really think need to be here, please email me particularly their email address. My email address is on the bottom of your handout and I'm putting it in the chat now. So I will open the link. Thank you. I'll give me 1 minute to do that when we finish up here. But if there are people that weren't here tonight and you think they need to be here, email me their email address sooner rather than later so I can email them the recording of this as well as the handout, so they have a week to get caught up and then they can join us for part 2. If you want to hang out and ask chapter specific questions, I'm happy to stay on for a couple of minutes. Other than that, you're welcome to go. Thank you so much for being here. And I will fix the post test right now so that you all can take it. So just give me 1 second.